Hi everyone, welcome to our webinar today. The topic for this webinar is FERC and clean energy. This webinar is being presented by the Clean Energy States Alliance for the RPS Collaborative, and we have with us on the line our host for this webinar, Warren Leon. Warren is the Executive Director of CISA, and he also manages the RPS Collaborative. And as you probably already know, we have as our guest speaker for this webinar, John Moore, who is the director of the Sustainable FERC Project at NRDC. So before I pass it over to our speakers, I'd like to go over a few quick housekeeping notes. You have a couple of options to join the audio portion of this webinar. You can call in using your computer mic and speakers, which is the default option, or you can call in using your telephone, using the info provided. If you would like to minimize the webinar console so that you can view the presentation full screen, you can do that by clicking on the little red or orange arrow that you see circled here. You can also use that arrow to expand it. Another very important note, we will be having a Q&A following the presentation. We're hoping to save about 15 to 20 minutes for that. So we ask that you please submit your questions and your comments as you think of them by typing them into the question box on the webinar console and hitting send. We do expect to have a lot of people on the webinar today, so that should mean a lot of questions. And it's easiest for us to get to the questions that are submitted early because we get a big rush of questions all at the end during the Q&A. So do type your question in early when you think of it, and we'll get to as many as we can. And a final note, this webinar is being recorded, and we will send you an email probably this afternoon, at least within the next 2 days, with a link to the webinar recording and also a link to the webinar slides. And we'll also be posting all of the webinar materials on our website at cisa.org/webinars. So with that, I would like to pass it over to our host for this webinar, Warren Leon. Warren?
Hey, thanks very much, Samantha. I want to tell people a couple of things about the Clean Energy States Alliance, which is sponsoring this webinar. We're a national nonprofit organization composed of public agencies, mostly state agencies, and you could see our members on this page. We're always looking to expand our membership. So, you know, if you're interested in joining us, go to our website, cisa.org, to find out about that, or go to cisa.org to learn about our various projects and activities. One of the things we do, if we go to the next slide, is we coordinate the RPS Collaborative. That's a project that is funded by the Energy Foundation and the U.S. Department of Energy. It's something where state RPS administrators, federal agency representatives, other stakeholders can all exchange information, learn about RPS best practices, RPS issues. We do a monthly newsletter with news from around the country about RPS matters. We do webinars like this one's today. We do an annual summit in Washington, D.C. If you want to get on the mailing list so that you'll get the newsletter and announcements of future webinars, just go to our website, cisa.org, and look up the RPS Collaborative, and you could join. So let's go to the next slide. Well, today we're focusing on the topic of FERC and clean energy, and we're very pleased to have with us to talk about this topic is John Moore. John is the director of the Sustainable FERC Project, which is a coalition-based initiative housed within the Natural Resources Defense Council. The project promotes the transition to a cleaner, low-carbon, and sustainable energy future through reforms to FERC jurisdictional markets, operations, and planning. John advocates on behalf of the project and other clean energy and environmental groups at FERC, as well as at PJM, MISO, and other regional transmission organizations. before becoming director of the Sustainable FERC Project, he was a senior attorney at the Environmental Law and Policy Center, and he was also an environmental attorney at the firms Aiken Gump and Squire Patton Boggs. On top of that, he's an all-around good guy, and he has unparalleled knowledge of FERC issues, so it will be great to hear from him today, and that's what we're going to do now. So it's up to you, John.
Thanks very much, Warren, and also Sam, for having me on this webinar as a guest. I really appreciate it. The FERC project, as Warren suggested, is a coalition of clean energy environmental organizations that advocate at FERC and work on integrating clean energy resources of all types into FERC jurisdictional markets. There's a lot happening at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission now, in part because it was really without a quorum for at least 6 months last year, and also because there's just an increasing number of issues, many of which, as my title of this webinar suggests, implicate state energy policies, especially an especially good topic for this with this group. And that, coupled with the transforming energy mix and some other factors, means that FERC's very involved in a lot of these issues. I should say at the beginning that if I can't answer a specific question, send me an email afterwards. I think we could have an in-depth discussion on any one of the 4 or 5 topics that we're touching on today. I'm just trying to hit the high points with at least some implied focus on meanings of some of the FERC actions on state clean energy policies, including even on sort of new best practices for implementing and designing state energy policies. So with that, by way of quick background, I thought I'd just provide a little bit of a data context for the conversation with some very selective energy data to help frame our conversation. First, the US power mix continues to evolve, at least at the bulk power system level. This shows a continuing decline for coal power and an increase in natural gas and renewables over the last 17 years. And this includes primarily power at the bulk system level and doesn't capture all of the rooftop solar and other distributed energy resources that have come online. One of the really fascinating data sets that we continue to look at is what's the mix of resources in the major regional transmission interconnection queues. And you can see the vast difference among 3 of the big RTOs, MISO, PJM, and SPP, the Southwest Power Pool. Look, for example, that in MISO, wind is the dominant new resource in the interconnection queues, whereas in PJM, the orange bar, it's clearly natural gas, in part because of the shale gas plays in Ohio and Pennsylvania. And then with SPP, you've got a huge amount of wind in the interconnection queue relative to the other resources. Solar energy, though, is also doing very well in the queue for a number of different reasons. This is also true. We're seeing some of the similar trends in other RTOs like ISO New England, although you naturally see more natural gas in the ISO New England queue. There's also a lot of wind in some of the out years, and I like the way in this queue and in the next queue it presents the projects that are coming online by year. But also in both the ISO New England queue and the New York ISO queue, which is on the next slide, we do see some hydro resources coming online for various reasons, and those are often interconnected through high voltage direct current transmission lines, especially for the large hydro coming from Canada. And this relates in part to the Massachusetts Energy Standard, which includes large hydro, which we might touch on a little bit later. Here then is the final chart on ISO Q data. This shows New York, also significant amount of natural gas, wind, and the light blue chart, the light blue chunk at the top is direct current lines through those high voltage direct current lines. Those are wind, primarily water or hydro projects. And one thing to remember is that not all those projects will be built. In fact, the majority probably won't be built. It really varies by RTO, but 35% is a good number to assume for projects being built. And those queues, that queue data changes all the time. Happy to send people more information on that if you're interested. This slide shows the change in the generation mix for retirements and additions at PJM over the years. This is mostly driven by the PJM, or at least verified by the PJM capacity market. Certainly these new resources at PJM get income from revenue from both the energy and capacity markets for most of their revenue. But it really shows that while sometimes in the press and from some of the interests we hear all about the retirements and the concerns about the retirements, this shows that we've also had a lot of resource additions in the energy mix, in this one for PJM in particular. So with retirements come additions, and this isn't just based on the minimum number of additional megawatts that any system needs to maintain reliability. PJM has far more than enough resources to maintain reliability and resource adequacy now. So we don't even need in some of these regions a one-to-one offsetting new generation to match retirements. That's a little bit of a myth. And finally, energy storage is coming on strong. The data, and most of this data is a projection for the future based on green tech media analysts. I think the main thing about this I want to emphasize is you can't think of storage just as generation, because the real value for storage is in providing some of the flexibility to the system, both in some of the ancillary services like frequency response and the like, but also in providing more flexibility for combinations of resources like renewable energy and other resources. That provides a lot of extra value, and we're starting to see more of that in trends in different parts of the country. So jumping into FERC now, as I said, FERC's been very busy over the last several months. And these bullet points list some of the major actions FERC has taken in the last 6 months. It doesn't include some of its work on natural gas, for example, but among the top line items are its ongoing work in grid resilience, rejecting the Department of Energy's proposed grid resilience pricing proposal back in January, issuing Order 841 on energy storage, along with Order 842 on setting new requirements for primary frequency response. FERC also rejected Kentucky's limits on energy efficiency that we're offering into PJM's capacity market, so there's a little bit of a state tension there. FERC also approved ISO New England's new proposal to limit the state policy effects in its capacity market. That's going to be one of the deep 5-minute dives during this webinar. It issued new generator interconnection rules in Order 845. Those are the first new rules since 2003. And it also has convened technical conferences on distributed energy resources and seasonal capacity. Both of those have happened this month. So a lot is happening. Wanted to just tease out 4 themes for some of these actions. One major theme or question is, can wholesale power markets exist harmoniously and with a minimum conflict with state energy policies? Another is a whole set of issues at the edge of the transmission distribution system interface, especially with more customer-owned resources that are on the retail side of the meter and under state jurisdiction for some, but not all of all purposes. The reliability and resilience theme, we could talk for hours about that. I'd like to say, though, I think at the end it distills down to mostly being a political issue. And finally, with transmission planning, especially transmission planning for clean energy resources, we're probably stuck in a little bit of a neutral gear right now, and a lot of thinking is going into that. So starting at the top with the relationship between FERC markets and energy policies, I wanted to just toss out a couple of ideas around or suppositions. This is a little bit more advocacy oriented, but it helps create a framing, I think, for some of the discussion. one of the incontrovertible facts actually is that state renewable energy standards and other policies, state-driven policies, support resources that deliver benefits not accounted for by FERC's regulation of wholesale rates. I'm talking about things like carbon reduction, other clean energy values, because FERC regulates the wholesale power rate that's focused on the basic megawatt, if I can say that, and not these other attributes. It's also true that state renewable energy standards and other state policies that exist outside of FERC's regulation affect those FERC market prices. And I said in here capacity market because that's so much of the focus, but it's also true that these resources directly and indirectly also affect the energy market prices. In fact, that's why one of the answers to the question in the following bullet is, do these state-sponsored resources depress FERC market prices? The answer is certainly yes in the short run, maybe not in the long run after prices reach a new balance. But the critical point, and the one, I suppose, advocacy point I would make during the webinar, is that FERC's markets need to be designed in a way to account for and reflect that these resources help meet reliability and resource adequacy goals. That's a big issue as we move forward. So let's first talk about what's happening on capacity markets, because this is where we're seeing one of these areas of potential clashes with state energy policies. The first one out of the gate at FERC this year is that it issued an order last month approving ISO New England's new proposal to reduce the price, what it views as the price depressive effects of state incentivized sponsored policy resources. That's kind of a mouthful right there. But basically, ISO New England, which I should say covers the northeast part of the United States, north of New York, and including Connecticut. The background on this is that the ISO proposed this idea of a new market design to help, quote unquote, accommodate the entry of state-sponsored clean energy resources, which include hydro, large hydro, into its market over time, while continuing to maintain what it believes are the necessary competitive pricing in its capacity market. And so it's been concerned about impacts of things like the Massachusetts Energy Diversity Act, which establishes some clean energy requirements, along with other state energy requirements in New England. To date, it has applied something called the minimum offer price rule, which is basically a screen to eliminate offer prices in its capacity market that it deems are below the minimum competitive offer necessary to ensure an effective capacity market. And this minimum offer price rule started out as a screen to eliminate market offers that were manipulative in nature, and that were, clearly wrong for some specific purposes. And since then, the ISO has expanded this minimum offer price rule to include nearly any offer that it deems is uncompetitive for a variety of reasons, including many resources, clean energy resources that are subsidized or motivated by state energy policies. It hasn't completely eliminated those clean energy policies from this MOPR, as it's affectionately called, but it's eliminated most of that. So in ISO New England's new process, it's created a two-step market policy solution. One is to run its what mostly looks like its usual way of running a capacity market auction that includes application of this minimum offer price rule. But then in the second step, it actually gives an opportunity for a swap to occur, if you will, between legacy resources, which the ISO is mostly thinking of as older fossil fuel plants, for legacy resources can swap their bids by selling their bids essentially to new clean energy resources that are these state-sponsored resources, and ones that don't clear that first step of the auction process for whatever reason. So it's a process that is new, and many people don't really know if this is going to work or not. And so ISO New England has just received approval from FERC to start implementing this in its next year's auction process. I already covered a little bit about what a MOPR does in terms of screening out resources offers. I hate to say it, but MOPR is going to show up in my next set of slides on discussing what PJM is doing as well. The thing about the FERC order last month that really struck a lot of people was that in addition to approving the ISO New England specific proposal for a new capacity market design, it included some pretty strong language on how FERC intended to use this MOPR as a default method for addressing the impacts of state policies on wholesale capacity markets. And I included that language in this slide on number 13, slide number 13. It engendered a strong dissent from Commissioner Rich Glick, one of the newer commissioners on at FERC, who called FERC's plan to use this MOPR as a default method a historically serious misstep. And he strongly disagreed with this idea, in part because he and many others think that all resources receive subsidies of some type or another, and that picking out a particular set of subsidies is not really gonna be the right way to go, and ultimately is just going to create more confusion in implementing these markets, and will result in a host of other problems. So this is something that actually attracted attention a week or two ago when the FERC commissioners were at a hearing in the House Energy and Commerce Committee, and so it's going to be interesting to see whether FERC backs off of this strong statement in any orders on rehearing, because it's facing a number of requests from different parties, including the Sustainable FERC Project and others, to sort of back off from this strong statement. Moving on to PJM. PJM is a little bit further behind in the starting order than ISO New England. It has just filed proposals at FERC to also deal with what it views as the adverse effects of state policies on its capacity market. So this is also big news. PJM covers the Mid-Atlantic and parts of the Midwest, and it has, I think, at least 170,000 megawatts of peak demand on the system. So it's a large RTO. And essentially, under PJM went to FERC and asked for FERC to pick one of two different choices. The first choice is one that PJM developed itself, which it calls the capacity repricing mechanism here that I mentioned in bullet point 2. The goal is from PJM's perspective, is to procure the correct amount of capacity for PJM's forward capacity market, but it would do so at what we think are inflated prices. Essentially, it increases capacity revenue for those resources that would have cleared the auction without having a price adjustment. It actually has, PJM also has a two-step process for running its proposed capacity market redesign, but it excludes the revenues that it determines some resources receive from the targeted state clean energy policies and any other policies from the auction prices. So it's actually in some ways less complicated than ISO New England's proposal, but it actually has some significant upward price impacts that we don't think actually are necessary, given that we believe that reliability and resource adequacy are already being assured under PJM's current process. PJM also filed at FERC an alternative idea. It's doing this because it couldn't get stakeholder support at the RTO for either one of these ideas. And in this idea, is actually something that the PJM Independent Market Monitor proposed, which is basically just an expansion of the existing price rule that PJM applies now. In this price rule, this minimum offer price rule, this expanded version, would block more resources that are sponsored by state subsidies and state incentives and whatnot. our concern with an expanded minimum offer price rule is that it probably would end up procuring redundant capacity in the short run, and it might actually force the retirement of some of the resources supported by those policies. Should state subsidies or state incentives of any sort be inadequate to cover any capacity market revenue shortfall. The key thing about this expanded MOPR is that it only exempts those renewables policies that are competitive and non-discriminatory, quote unquote. So, and you have things like having at least 3 bidders in any auction, in any state auction, plus many other criteria. PJM actually invited FERC to consider approving an even broader version of MOPR that would not contain any exemption for RPS policies. So I think generally speaking, a lot of folks from representing consumer groups, industry, others are concerned that either one of these 2 proposals would increase capacity market prices without any significant benefit. Now here's a slide that we probably could spend a whole hour on as well, which is, given the percolation of these new proposals at FERC, along with some other issues pending out there, how does a state design RPSs given these things? And a few of our recommendation includes points like keep the requirements at a state level. Doing so reduces the risk of legal challenge. Make contracts unbundled. Don't have commissions ordering utilities to enter into specific contracts. Let the utilities run the process. Things like that. Another is to watch the outcomes of the zero emission credit litigation that's currently in 2 different federal appellate courts in Illinois and New York. These are cases that challenge the Illinois and New York zero emission credit programs for nuclear power plants. And the outcomes of those 2 cases, which we would certainly expect within the next year, if not less, will very well could affect FERC's movement in the future on some of these issues. And it's just really difficult to, just generally speaking, it's difficult to control the risk of what FERC might do to block capacity market access in the Eastern RTOs. So all things to watch out for in the future. Now, maybe just turning to a second batch of issues, Order 841, leveling the playing field on energy storage. This is FERC issued Order 841 2 months ago now, and it basically helps to create a level playing field for energy storage, much anticipated by many people. It creates a new participation model that requires RTOs to account for the physical and operational characteristics of electric storage resources through bidding parameters and other means. Most RTOs have a standard set of tariff rules to establish the conditions for participating in energy markets, capacity markets, and ancillary services markets. And Order 841 says you actually have to create this new set of rules that take into account really a lot of the unique characteristics of energy storage. Some have even said, since FERC issued Order 841, that we ought to think about applying something like Order 841 to all resources. A couple of the key points are that RTO can't increase the size levels for these services beyond 100 kilowatts. A critical point is that FERC deferred action on the aggregation of distributed energy resources. This was another really important point from our perspective. And FERC basically said it's too complicated. We're not going to include the aggregation of rooftop solar and other DERs in this storage rule. That's the reason that FERC had a technical conference on distributed energy resources earlier this month. And so we're anxiously awaiting further FERC action following that technical conference. There are some shortcomings in Order 841. I think one sort of a process shortcoming is that there's a lot of, or maybe it's not process, it's really substance in the content, is that it really gives a lot of flexibility to the ISOs and RTOs to how it can design some of these market rules. And we're seeing some of this at MISO right now, where it's seeking to phase in the amount of smaller resources and also limit the amount of smaller resources that it can include in market design. This actually gets to it reminds me of a broader point around FERC rules, which is that it's important to remember that, you know, FERC sets the new floor for standards in most cases. FERC is not trying to develop best practices for rules. It really looks to the RTOs to develop a lot of those best practices. Instead, it is setting the new floors for practices that it says are necessary to avoid unjust and unreasonable rates. That's really important, I think, going into any FERC proceeding. And it's just sort of a reflection on FERC practice and procedure, that's the way FERC operates. And it means that stakeholders need to always continue to work through RTO processes, stakeholder processes, if they think that the existing processes, you know, while maybe technically necessary or satisfactory under FERC rules, could be better. And of course, if they don't believe that they're satisfactory under current FERC rules and produce unjust and unreasonable rates, then you go to FERC and ask for a change. Getting back to our issue of the tension between FERC and state energy policies, one of the interesting things about Order 841 is that it says that RTOs must allow storage resources to access wholesale markets. That's a big point, and it's one that you can imagine a lot of states and others, some others express some concern about. Some seeing that requirement as infringing on state jurisdiction over retail sales. So I think our view and the view of many folks is that FERC has overlapping jurisdiction with states over quote unquote practices affecting wholesale power rates. It's very important. This has been the subject of a lot of litigation, including recent Supreme Court cases. And, you know, FERC's setting of rules for market access, should it choose to do so, and that's really important, should it choose to do so, is really the quintessential practice affecting a rate. What are the rules for market access? And it also just reflects the fact that electrons are in interstate commerce, and FERC has jurisdiction over sales for resale in interstate commerce. So this is a significant set of issues. And I would encourage you, if people are listening to this and want to look at some of the views of this, differing views on this, go to the FERC dockets. The docket number is RM 16-23, and you can see some of the filings that have occurred just in the last couple of weeks that discuss the different positions on this. Again, could be another webinar discussion itself. Bottom line here, from our perspective, is as much as possible trying to seek conflict and trying to seek compatibility over conflict, recognizing that FERC regulates the basic megawatt of electricity, and states regulate other attributes and preferences. In capacity markets, FERC's role is to regulate capacity markets in ways that procure the correct amount of capacity when accounting for state policies, and it shouldn't take actions or approve ISO proposals that coerce states into changing those policies. That's obviously one of the underlying concerns about implementing those capacity market designs that I talked about earlier. And that also states cannot bar consumer access to wholesale power markets. That's on the consumer access side. I think in addition to these points, we're all very interested in costs and looking at what benefits, if any, do consumers get for higher costs across the board wherever they exist, whether FERC or at the state level. And just a couple more slides here before we wrap up. Resilience and reliability, obviously in the news a lot, has been for the last year. I think really, and I refer to last year, I'm thinking about Secretary Rick Perry's request that the Department of Energy study the asserted baseload, or the asserted attributes of baseload power plants, quote unquote, back in April. The Department of Energy did that study, and I think the staff-driven content in it was really good, and it actually highlighted that the RTOs and utilities and others are all working constantly on resilience and reliability. I think where it sort of veered off the rails was in some of the more politicized recommendations for subsidies or premiums for baseload power plants, even though there was no demonstration at all that they brought unique resilience or reliability attributes to the power system. That didn't stop, and I guess in part because the study did make those political recommendations. DOE then went to FERC in fall of 27 and basically asked FERC to add in a premium to wholesale power prices to preference power plants with at least a 90-day fuel supply. Well, there was nothing in the record that suggested that a 90-day fuel supply was necessary for reliability, and in fact, the data shows quite clearly that fuel shortages are responsible for a vanishingly small fraction of all grid disruptions. And in fact, that very small vanishing amount is attributable to one or two coal plants that had problems with with their coal supply. So, basically there isn't really evidence of a resilience problem that the current rules can't solve. And there's no there. And maybe just, stepping back a second, what is resilience? It's, for FERC's purposes, regulating the bulk power system. It's mostly, in fact, it's entirely an element of reliability, because the NERC, the North American Electric Reliability Corporation reliability standards that utilities implement and follow along after FERC approval, those all account for resilience issues. If a transmission line goes down, there's other transmission lines to pick up the slack and continue to carry the current from generation to customers. It's obviously a lot harder on the distribution system since we don't have a networked distribution grid with a lot of redundancy built into it. But I mean, the fact remains that even as we're seeing more severe weather events, it's not surprising that most of the problems are on the distribution side of the equation and not on the transmission side, and certainly not on the generation side. FERC is asking for comments on these issues now. It's already received comments from the RTOs in an ongoing proceeding, and the RTOs, mostly have said we've got it under control. That's our job. PJM and ISO New England have proposed. They're working on a couple of their own very regional issues that have varying degrees of merit behind them. I think the one thing we probably all agree on is that FERC should not issue any sort of a sweeping new rule that preferences a particular class of resource just because of its fuel type. And then finally, and I'm happy to send people more information on those, on that information as well. Our comments, the comments of a lot of people, will be filed on May 9th, so we want to watch out for that. Finally, just a little bit on transmission. One specific transmission-related order FERC recently issued was Order 845 on generator interconnection. This was significant because new generation, especially a lot of the wind generators in the Midwest, have complained about delays in the interconnection process working with the RTOs. They've expressed concerns about the lack of transparency in the process, and by the same token, the RTOs have challenges managing a large number of requests for interconnection that frequently move around, and allocating the correct allocation of costs for new interconnection requests and the new interconnection lines is, a really thorny issue. So Order 845 starts to deal with this. It doesn't address all of the cost issues, but it definitely improves the transparency and certainty for interconnection customers in a number of different ways around what the utilities and RTOs are supposed to provide publicly about the status of interconnection requests and the like. I don't think it does everything at all, and I know a number of parties will be seeking additional FERC action on some of the cost issues in particular. One of the good things about Order 845, for energy storage, is that it allows interconnection agreements to be tailored to the level of service requested, which actually can be lower than nameplate capacity for the interconnection. That just means that if you have a wind and energy storage resource applying for an interconnection service request together, you can, for example, use the nameplate capacity of the wind resource, say 50 or 100 megawatts, for example, and not include the 20 megawatt storage resource, so long as the total level of output doesn't exceed that 50 megawatts or 100 megawatts total for the capacity, the installed capacity level for the one resource. So that's kind of cool, and that's going to be interesting to see how that all plays out. Finally, and this is really just a wrap-up slide on transmission in generally, we really haven't seen much, if any, large new transmission built in this country in the last several years for renewable energy development. You know, we have a lot of renewable energy. We have a lot of wind power, especially in the Great Plains and the upper Midwest. We have the offshore wind that's now starting to be developed. We even have wind, for example, in upstate New York that could be delivered to downstate New York. And developing support for these longer transmission lines is very difficult. Building new HV, high voltage direct current lines from some of the wind-rich resource areas in the Midwest to the east has been very hard, especially with groups like Cleanline continuing to work on projects, but facing opposition from a number of quarters. And the barriers that I've identified here, which are by no means exclusive, also suggest some of the solutions to the problems. There's a lack of state interest in RTOs for developing broad regional and interregional plans. I see that a lot in the Midwest at MISO in particular. And of course, there are valid reasons for some of the concerns. States want to develop their own resources, and that's understandable. And it's also true that transmission can also bring in really high value and zero fuel cost resources from outside a particular state. It's also true that some RTO transmission owning members aren't terribly enthused about some of these new lines. One of the reasons, and not the only reason, but one of the reasons is that FERC has required competition for developing some of these lines with third-party providers, and that has paradoxically actually in some cases slowed the development of these lines because of the risk of competition to some of the incumbent transmission owning utilities. Again, these are not true in all cases, but certainly I think what some people have seen. And finally, there's been a lack of federal support for one-step interregional planning and allocation of costs. FERC issued Order 1000 now on transmission planning back, I think, in 2011, and that required RTOs to plan regionally for transmission within each RTO region, which actually most were already doing. It only required that RTOs coordinate between each other for building longer lines. So they do some transmission planning back and forth, but as is so often the case even within the region, one region's cost is another region's benefit, and trying to correctly identify the costs and benefits is challenging, especially if you don't include all the benefits that a new transmission line might bring, like zero carbon resources and some of the other benefits that just aren't measured under current law. So one fix that many are urging FERC to do is to be more explicit about requiring interregional planning and developing new ways to allocate the costs and benefits, so that it's more clear that larger lines can, in some cases, actually bring net benefits. Another solution is for FERC to make clear that the new lines can bring in a broader number of benefits, which helps to offset some of the costs. Again, this is a topic that we could probably talk about for another 5 hours, just trying to give everyone a little bit of a sense of the flavor for this. And I expect to continue to hear folks discussing the need for some of these policy solutions at both Congress and FERC in the coming year. So I think that's it. Really happy to take questions now in the remaining 15 minutes that we have on any of these topics.
Hey, John, thanks. Well, we do have quite a few questions here. Some of them are quite narrow and some of them are broad. Here's a broader question. For those who are in the footprint of a place that isn't within an ISO's service territory. Can you comment on FERC's role for non-ISO regions?
Sure. Much less of a direct impact on the energy market side, because if the utilities are mostly dispatching the resources themselves and also entering into contracts themselves with third-party independent power producers, FERC reviews those contracts, but there is no centralized auction, New York Stock Exchange type market. But FERC does have some control and regulatory authority over the planning piece of this, because in Order 1000, FERC made clear that every region and subregion of the country had to follow these transmission planning principles for planning for public policy projects in particular. That was one of the notable outcomes of Order 1000. I'm not saying that Order 1000 has really been that effective in practice. We've worked a lot in the Southeast, which is a non-organized electricity market region, and progress is slower there because there isn't the same well-developed stakeholder framework for looking at planning issues the way there is in an RTO.
Going back to FERC 841 about storage, does that order require energy storage to have more than 4 hours of storage capacity?
It in some cases it may, and I have to get I want to be able to make sure that I answer that question exactly correctly, so I can get back to the questioner on that, who should send me that question. I'd also just put a plug in for the Energy Storage Association, who did a fantastic hour-long webinar a couple of weeks ago, and that's now available on the ESA website, and it includes everything you really need to know about energy storage in Order 841.
Okay. With regard to resilience, can you speak to FERC's role related to cybersecurity for the grid?
Sure. I think cybersecurity is incredibly important, and it cuts across all, across both the transmission and distribution systems. FERC and the RTOs and NERC and DOE, others all have a big role to play in cybersecurity, and so FERC approves a lot of the cybersecurity standards that NERC is working on, and so I think it's very important to resilience. It's outside of FERC's basic market authority, but it falls under FERC's reliability jurisdiction, and I think that it's something that is probably, as we all know from the headlines, is dominating a lot of people's thinking now, in addition to the increasing severity of severe storms and whatnot.
Yeah. And do you think that it's probable that FERC will essentially reject the PJM filing and tell them to refile with just a single proposal?
That's a good question. I'm not going to speculate exactly as to what FERC could do. I think that what PJM is doing exactly what ISO New England has done in the past. It's called a jump ball filing, and the RTO does that when the stakeholders can't agree on a particular course of action. I think it's the first time PJM has done this in my memory, and I'm fairly confident that. No, I should never say that. I think PJM filed, both proposals with, I would assume, the at least implicit understanding from FERC staff that would be fine to do, and that FERC would, go from there on which one it actually chose. So, given that ISO New England has done this in the past more than once, I think it's, and assuming that the FERC finds that PJM's tariff allows it to do this, I think the real question will be, which one does FERC endorse? And it's a good time to mention that FERC's authority to tailor or modify some of these proposals that RTOs give to it is really somewhat more restrictive than it used to be. Another court case came out last year, the NRG case, that basically limits FERC's ability to sort of pick and choose elements of a filing that it thinks are comply with the Federal Power Act, and pick those that comply and reject those that doesn't, that don't comply. So I think it just means that RTOs are going to be more cautious about going. Well, on the one hand, they might be more cautious to going to FERC before getting something locked down. On the other hand, it's probably going to make it less likely for RTOs to try to seek as much consensus from different stakeholder groups on a particular proposal if they don't actually think that FERC is going to agree with it. So I think it's sort of a troubling long-term, a potentially troubling long-term trend if FERC just has to do up and down orders in many of these difficult cases.
And could the discretion and flexibility that FERC has extended to ISOs be used constructively to work more cooperatively with states? And is that desirable if FERC ultimately approves distributed energy resource aggregation for all power markets?
I think cooperation is always good. It's challenging. I think most of what FERC has said is open to that. I think a couple of these statements that I called out, especially the MOPR statement, might suggest otherwise. I tried to be able to reconcile our position and why sometimes it makes sense and sometimes it doesn't. So it's a challenging question, and I think that as technology and as digitization of our economy moves forward, as technology moves forward, and as the customers and consumers, can more seamlessly interconnect to the grid, literally from their homes and businesses, we'll start to see some of these jurisdictional concerns fall away. So I think we're definitely in part of an evolving process. Yes, the resource mix has changed. I think equally important is that the customer is now a bigger part of the equation and can be thought of as providing electricity supply now in ways that, in the past, the consumer was the customer and only purchased and never sold or provided. And that's inevitably going to it's going to create some of those tensions because states regulate the distribution grid, FERC regulates the transmission grid. That's generally the way that typically has happened over time. So changes are definitely in the making.
And can you mention a couple of market changes that you think would be desirable for FERC ISOs to undertake to optimize clean energy resources?
Sure. I think a big one would be that FERC needs to, number one, move a little bit away from the capacity market construct in the East, which accounts for well over 230,000 megawatts of power, if my math is correct in my head. That's PJM, New England, and New York. Because the capacity market is, mostly a one-size-fits-all targeted to peak summer demand concept. I think if we start looking at new ways to monetize energy, like bringing back the value of power purchase agreements, which really are driving still continue to drive a lot of the new renewable energy projects on the grid, that's a step in the right direction. So going back to power purchase agreements, one of the things we're kicking around very, very generally is there a way to have a more liquid, if you will, PPA framework within an RTO, so it's all not just behind the scenes. So I think that's one clear step. That's something FERC could do. I know a number of different stakeholders joined together in a letter to FERC earlier this year. NRDC, American Public Power Association, others, the wind groups, solar, all basically went to FERC and said, here, the capacity markets are probably going in the wrong direction. here are some ideas for doing something that actually gives more power back to the states in some way, especially around those state energy resource mandates. I think also looking at capabilities markets instead of capacity markets, markets that reward this flexibility more significantly. That's important. I don't think it's necessary in all regions, and I really want to stress that a one-size-fits-all approach just doesn't make sense. MISO has many thousands of megawatts of wind power on the system, and it's done pretty well so far without a really liquid and valuable ramping product. It's got something like a ramping product in place now. It's not a full-on separate product in the way that some people have talked about. And it hasn't really needed much more than that. I think it's now recognizing that something has to happen. I think the way you forecast peak demand is important. The way you forecast energy capacity on the system is important, especially with more variable energy resources. I think taking a look at reserve margins is going to be important, and the role of reserve margins in setting capacity targets. Load forecasting, that's something else FERC should probably get into, because load forecasting in some regions probably isn't keeping up with the evolving system mix that I talked about earlier, with the need for RTOs to really more fundamentally account for the energy that the consumers are providing through whatever program.
Good. Well, we got a question. Someone was asking whether the Sustainable FERC Project has written a summary of the impact of the ISO New England MOPR decision on renewables in the capacity market. Before you answer that, I want to let people know that we're going to be doing a webinar through the RPS Collaborative next month on that topic, with Paul Peterson of Synapse Energy speaking on the topic. But has the Sustainable FERC Project done any writing on that topic?
I would first point to a blog post by Bruce Ho from the Sustainable FERC Project, who who is our representative at the ISO for our coalition, one of the representatives of the coalition. So I'd Google Bruce Ho, ISO New England capacity market, and that will get you one answer. We're also working on a product that is going to be, that we're calling the MOPR Explainer, the Minimum Offer Price Rule Explainer. That's more of a multi-page fact sheet that explains the purpose and effects of this MOPR and the successors to MOPR on clean energy standards. That ought to be out in the next few weeks at sustainableferc.org.
Good. And
Warren, I don't mean to interrupt you, but I would also say point to blogs by Jennifer Chen as well on the sustainableferc.org website that address the PJM capacity market proposals. And I think you'll see even more discussion around the PJM capacity market proposals, I think, in the coming weeks, and certainly after FERC issues a final order on that later this year.
Good. Regarding the PJM proposal, which would exclude revenue from targeted state policies, how does this exclude revenue related to REC prices for RPS compliance?
Yeah, it's a good detailed question, and I think it depends on how it depends on, well, I would say that it would exclude REC revenue to some extent, assuming that revenue is factored into the offer price. So if it's the result of a subsidy or it's a result of a state program, and RECs can be that way, then it would be included. If it's not if you're getting a REC and it's not the result of a direct state program, then I think it's a lot less clear. It's actually a great question to think about, because obviously we've got REC markets that the REC markets exist independent of the state program. So that would be a good one to ask the PJM and independent market monitor when it comes to actually implementing whichever, or reviewing at least whichever proposal FERC accepts. But that very well, I don't know if that merits a separate blog post or not, but that's a great question.
Well, we're coming to the end of the hour. In a minute, I'm going to give you an opportunity to have a couple last words if there's anything else you want to leave people with. But I know that there are a lot of questions I wasn't able to get to, and folks can see on the screen. Oh, you can't see John's email address on the screen. If we could put that one up, it would be great, because John has said he is willing to respond to people's written questions. So I'd encourage you to write there. So do you have any famous last words?
Only that the tension between federal and state energy policies is going to continue apace and will provide lots of work for lawyers, unfortunately, over the next couple of years. I've counted at least 6 or 7 cases at FERC and the courts right now that we're involved with in different ways that specifically deal with federal state tensions. And we think they're reconcilable, but I definitely think that the combination of the continuing existence of some of these renewable energy standards, coupled with this real dynamic and I think it will be a growing shift towards more customer involvement in the power grid, which inevitably raises jurisdictional questions. That's going to be a fundamental fact of life for the next few years, and you see it in a lot of filings at the FERC now.
Well, thanks for those thoughts, and thanks for the whole presentation. That was very useful and interesting, and I think everybody on the phone will join me in thanking John for the good job, and I hope folks will join us for future RPS Collaborative webinars. Thank you.